Jeff, let's just jump right into it. You chaired a Lancet commission to explore, among other things, the origins of COVID. Could you please just share with the audience what you learned through that experience?
Well, I learned it's a complicated story, and I learned that we haven't been hearing exactly the full story all along the way. This Lancet Commission was set up in mid 2020, a few months after the outbreak began, to look at what was happening, to try to make recommendations along the way of this global emergency, and then to take a step back, what we thought would be at the end or towards the end of the pandemic, and make an assessment of what happened and what lessons can we learn. We've just issued the final report of the Lancet Commission at the time of the UN General Assembly in September. One of the topics, as you mentioned, was where did this virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, come from? And I can tell you at the beginning, I was reading the newspapers and I had enough experience with zoonotic diseases. I had worked on AIDS, public policy. Of course, I'm an economist, not a medical doctor, research scientist in virology, but I had worked on zoonotic breakthroughs and pandemic response in the past and had chaired a commission for the World Health Organization more than 20 years ago on uh, investing in health for economic development. So I thought this is like SARS, actually, in 2003 4, which was a spillover, we think, from a market. Probably a palm civet is the animal that is designated as most likely culprit of the first SARS infection. And I read the newspapers and I thought, well, this is probably yet another of these zoonotic diseases, like Ebola or like HIV, in fact, or like SARS. Then came the attacks starting in Washington. Well, this is something that China concocted. And I thought, oh my God, here we go. Now we're going to turn this into geopolitics. So I more or less felt even more convinced that this was a natural spillover. And when I was asked to head the Lancet Commission, I reached out to a person that I knew had been working on zoonotic spillovers for a decade, Peter Daszak. So I stepped right into what would be an absolutely wild ride. Peter Daszak heads something called EcoHealth Alliance, and it is an organization based on the threats of zoonotic spillovers, that is, emerging diseases coming out of nature. And they were doing monitoring and collecting viruses and looking for outbreaks in rural areas in China and Southeast Asia. So I thought, oh, go to the source, go to the person who's most monitoring this and ask that person to head the task force on origins. Now, the Lancet Commission had 10 task forces, so this was only one of the topics, but one that was very interesting and quite important. And Dashik went ahead after I asked him to head that task force and recruited a group of scientists, pretty much like minded scientists. I could see people who were working one way or another on natural spillovers. So uh, that went on for a few months, and we were attending to other issues. Should you wear face masks? What about lockdowns? Is the vaccine coming or not? How would it be used? There were so many issues and debates, and the origins was, in a way, seemingly an intellectual exercise, but not the most immediate practical concern. And by the summer and fall of 2020, one major article had come out in Nature Medicine in March 2020 called The Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2, which I had read carefully, I thought, which described why this was a natural spillover. And there was a section in the middle that said, not from a lab, just doesn't have the right markings, and nothing in the lab was much like this. And you could really rule that out. So by the late fall 2020, I was knowingly telling other people, yeah, this is natural. Don't listen to this stuff. Lots of conspiracies, crazy ideas around, but I'm pretty much on the inside, and I can tell you that this is natural. I think things started to turn in early 2021. Uh, First of all, there were a few dogged reporters, very few, and not one in a mainstream outlet.
Mhm.
Nobody in the New York Times or Washington Post or Wall Street Journal or Financial Times or any of the major English language newspapers that were saying anything other than, well, it's natural, and China's probably hiding what happened in the marketplace, but clearly it came out of nature. But there were a few reporters even filing lawsuits. Tell us something about what's going on. And of course, I started to hear the controversies around EcoHealth Alliance because people were saying, hey, maybe EcoHealth Alliance, the group that I had basically brought into the Lancet Commission, but because it was there, maybe they know more than they're telling us. And so I started asking questions and started reading the controversies late. I can't take any credit for early insight on this, but I started asking. And uh, of course, what happened was more and more uh, disparities with the natural story started to come out. First, no animal was found anywhere in China, tens of thousands tested, and no evidence whatsoever of a natural spillover. And more stories started to come out that, well, some fairly dangerous research or suspicious research or research we don't really understand was underway at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And lo and behold, connected with EcoHealth Alliance. So, of course, uh, I was open minded about this to be sure, and started asking questions of Dashik, and was not getting honest answers from Dashik. He was evasive, denying that research that others were vociferously claiming to be done uh, was actually done. And he said things that immediately I knew were not true to media, saying, we don't do any research like that. We don't have any experiments of that kind. All we do is work with the local communities. Statements that were absolutely untrue and deeply misleading. Well, that's extraordinarily uncomfortable if you're chairing a commission. And at that point, I started calling around to many more of my friends and colleagues, and they pointed me to others. And I got a thorough briefing really for the first time about a year, no, less than a year, but probably by early spring 2021. And the experiments that were being done were explained to me. And this was really striking for me. Again, I'm an economist, I'm not a lab bench scientist, but I can read the articles, and I was given a reading list, and I went through them, and I went back to Dashig and said, Peter, this is really concerning. I'd like to see your uh, grant proposal that is the base of this work. And he said, no, no, I can't give that to you. And I said, what do you mean? This is an NIH grant and I need to see it. I need to understand this right now. No, 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 I can't give this to you. My lawyers said I can't. Whoa, Peter, we're a transparent commission. You're heading a task force on origins. If you can't give this, you can't chair this commission. That's for sure.
Just to
The,
clarify, Jeffrey, that was a
the,
funded grant? That grant?
yes, yeah, that one
So
was a funded grant,
so
and I wanted to know the details of it.
it was potentially available through FOIA or other method in
Well,
the future.
it soon came out by FOIA, so I got to read it, but not from Dashik. And so I started to see the resistance inside. I told him he could not chair this task force. He could stay on the commission, but he could not be in charge of this. Then, soon afterwards, that very grant was FOIA'd and was released by Freedom of Information Act. Whoa, that was quite concerning because this documented exactly the dangerous research, especially in this case, creating chimeric viruses by taking virus backbones and replacing spike proteins on that backbone to test for pathogenicity and transmissibility and infectivity of the chimeras. So the kind of gain of function research that was increasingly being debated on the fringes, but not in the mainstream. And where NIH was saying, we, we don't, we don't support gain of function research. And there was the confrontation between Rand Paul and Fauci, and Fauci absolutely denied all of this. But then the pipeline started to open up a little bit. And I saw that what Dashig had represented to me was absolutely not true. So I told him, you can't be on this commission. You can't be on the task force. At which point, the task force erupted against me. Sachs, you're siding with the dark side, anti-science, and so forth. And I said, look, I want from all of you clarification about potential conflicts of interest. Are you associated with Wuhan Institute of Virology? Are you associated with EcoHealth Alliance? Do you have other affiliations that could be potential conflicts of interest? Because I'm chairing a transparent, open, unbiased assessment, and I need to know now from you. Silence. Silence from the group. I gave them a week. Please submit things. If you have any doubts, please talk to me about the doubts because I need to know about them and we can talk them through. Silence. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, no response at all, except that one of the scientists on this task force absolutely lambasted me for recklessness, anti-science, and really in extraordinarily crude terms, I must say. Pretty, I don't know, this is just words in a world of much more violence. So, one can take it, but still really excoriating terms about gross irresponsibility and gross anti-scientific and unprofessional behavior because of this and so forth. Then the next FOIA came out the next week and showed that that guy was a co-investigator with Dashig on the grant. I could not believe it because I had asked for any kind of conflict of interest. The guy that is excoriating me is up to his neck in exactly this research program and never admitted it.
So
Okay,
could I ask you about that
sure.
particular research program? So it's NIAID,
That's
headed
correct.
by Fauci. They do bioweapons research, and some of their funding comes from defense or sort of spooky sources. And they're one of the biggest in terms of funding institutes at NIH. Am I correct in thinking that?
Yeah, they don't call it bio warfare, and I cannot authoritatively tell you what they do. They call it biodefense, but the fact of the matter is that they manage the U.S. biodefense program to a very significant extent, and
Right.
they don't want us looking. That's for sure. They
Right.
don't
So
want us to know. They don't want us to know the details, and they don't tell us the details. And
so
so,
by treaty, we are not allowed to do offensive research on bioweapons, but we're allowed to do defensive research. But the line is very blurry because if you're developing a vaccine against potential weapons your enemies might use, you still need to have access to dangerous viruses that the enemy might use. And so the line is, I think, very unclear between offensive and defensive uses of bioweapons.
well, I think it's unclear for a much simpler reason as well, which is that it is completely unsupervised from the public point of view. We don't have a clue as to what's going on, and they don't want us to know. And they're not telling, and they're not telling Congress, and they're not telling the public. And by the way, one of the interesting Freedom of Information Act responses by NIH, by this NIAID, was a uh, lawsuit for them to report on their research on SARS-like viruses, coronaviruses, and they they released, and you cannot even believe it, but you can find it online. I think it was The Intercept that had this one. They released a 290-page report that has the cover page of the NIH research program, essentially on beta coronaviruses. And then every one of the 290 pages is 100% redacted. In other words, they gave, as response to the lawsuit, 290 blank pages, and we're supposed to trust them. Which, of course, as my story progresses, I I don't trust them to turn around because they haven't told the truth from the very start. So, just to not go into every twist and turn of this saga, suffice it to say that the group that had assembled was completely in up to their necks in EcoHealth Alliance, Wuhan, everything. So I disbanded that entirely. But we came to understand pretty quickly that there were two huge kinds of problems that were at stake. One was the research that was underway was dangerous, certainly. And it was US funded, US backed, and US technology, I would say, to a great extent, and especially technology led out of University of North Carolina, where this cutting edge viral manipulation is done. And that's one part. And somebody leaked the proposal that was made to DARPA, the Defense Department Research Agency, for an extraordinarily dangerous set of experiments, a really remarkable document called the Diffuse Proposal, which is a three-way partnership of University of North Carolina, Wuhan Institute of Virology, and EcoHealth Alliance. And the proposal on page 10, which is, it says, this is 2017, it says there are more than 180 previously unreported strains of sarbecoviruses, that is SARS-like viruses. On page 11, it says, we will test these or examine these viruses, and when they don't have a particular part of the genome called a proteolytic cleavage site, we will insert a proteolytic cleavage site into the virus. What they're saying there is we will deliberately make these previously unreported viruses much more dangerous because the research program at UNC and in association with others had established clearly that adding in this piece of the genome called a proteolytic cleavage site, and specifically a furin cleavage site, because furin is the enzyme that cleaves this spike protein. By inserting that, you create a dangerous pathogen. That's the bottom line. And
So
that was the research program.
can I interrupt for 1 second? So
Yeah.
this was 5 years ago that this proposal was written, and 5 years in the field of gene editing is a really long time. So when you talk to actual experts, how many of them would say not only could could COVID have come from the lab, but even putting that aside, if we wanted to, could we actually, with today's technology, actually make something as dangerous as COVID? Well,
Well, first of all, what we have in SARS-CoV-2 is a SARS-like virus with a furin cleavage site, and maybe with some other tinkering, but the core of the biological innovation, whether from nature or from a laboratory, is to add the furin cleavage site. And that is 4 amino acids that make all the difference in the infectivity. SARS just is not very infectious. That's why it died out
yes,
after killing several hundred people, but it died out. It didn't kill 18 million people because it's not so infectious. Add in RRAR sequence into this genome, and wow, you've got a doozy. And so the real question and I'm coming to this second part, the real question is where'd that furin cleavage site come from? Okay, well, the diffuse grant said, maybe they put it there because, especially in retrospect, looking at the sequence of research articles and interviews that Ralph Barrick, among others, gave, he's the head of the lab at UNC, they were on the trail of furin cleavage sites, that's for sure. This was a major focus because they knew that's the secret sauce to make a SARS-like virus really dangerous. So they were on that trail and they wanted to do these experiments. Okay, that's one thing that we learned in the fall of 2021. We, the public. The second thing that we learned is that there was an incredibly suspicious, and I would say at this point, manipulative series of meetings in late January to early February 2020 that has been brilliantly documented by the reporter Emily Kopp at the U.S. Right to Know organization. And through all the lawsuits that U.S. Right to Know and others have undertaken, she has pieced together a timeline that really makes your hair stand on end. And the timeline is basically that in late January 2020, a lot of scientists were saying, whoa, look at that furin cleavage site. How'd that get in there? That's really unusual. Bats, by the way, would not like that furin cleavage site, so it didn't evolve within the bat reservoir because RRAR is not good for bats, which hold this enterically, not in the lungs, and because
mhm,
of that, the furin cleavage site is not something that would naturally evolve within the bat population. So a number of scientists are saying, wait a minute, where'd that thing come from? This is, again, within a few weeks of the genome being known. And it was posted ostensibly January 11th, 2020 for the world to see. And the scientists looked at it and said, quite immediately, they focused right in on this S1, S2 junction of the spike protein, saw the furin cleavage site, said something really odd is going on. So
mhm.
Fauci and Collins being the head of NIH, called a conference call for uh, February 1,
And this
2020.
this is the call with Jeremy Farrar at the Wellcome
Yes.
Trust.
So Jeremy Farrar at Wellcome Trust organizes the call and then summarizes it in an email. And thanks to not thanks to transparency and honesty, but thanks to Freedom of Information Act, we know what was on the call. And what was on the call was that most of the scientists said, pretty suspicious. Some said, I can't figure out how nature could ever have done this. Others said, 80-20 lab, 70-30 lab, 50-50 lab. But basically, oh, this really could have come out of a laboratory.
So
Then,
just to
yeah,
reiterate, early 2020, initial reactions, having known that now that we knew what the genome was for COVID, initial reactions were plausible to have been of lab origin, maybe some people even 80-20 lab origin. How do you think those numbers have changed in the subsequent 2 years? So, if you talk to those same scientists and they give you their suppose hypothetically, they gave you their honest opinion, would those numbers have changed in either direction very much?
well, I think the stunning thing that we know is that within 3 days, they went from 70-30 lab or 80-20 lab to 100-0 natural. Because what we see is a narrative
Right.
concocted.
Right.
Not,
I accept your claim that there has been an active cover up or
yes.
deception.
Yep.
The secondary issue is, though, what is the sort of best scientific opinion today about
Okay.
the
So the best scientific opinion depends because those who are in on this narrative are dug in deeply. And when other scientists say, you know, boy, this looks like a lab creation, or it easily could have been a lab creation, or that isn't that exactly what the diffuse grant said it would
Mhm,
be. They get excoriated by this quite narrow group. It's not a large group. It is a group around Farrar and Fauci. It's actually not the profession by any means. It's a quite small group of the same people from the start. At the very start, they said lab. 3 days later, they said nature. You can even track comments that, gee, this would be bad if the rumor started that this was from a lab and so forth. So they concocted a narrative without the scientific basis. What's fascinating for me, and I mentioned it obliquely earlier, was I then went back to read Proximal Origins as all of this was spilling out. And I just could not believe what I had missed the first time. And I think what everybody missed because it's almost a joke. In the section where it says this couldn't have come from a lab, the argument is this couldn't have come from a lab because it's unlike any previously reported virus. That's the argument. Well, first of all, it could have been an unreported virus. We know from diffuse that there were more than 180 unreported viruses. But they say, no, it wasn't like a previously reported virus. And then what made my jaw drop is the footnote to that statement is to a 2014 paper. That's almost a joke. I recommend everybody look at footnote 20 to Proximal Origins because it's unbelievable. They're looking at an outbreak in 2020 and they're denying that it could have come from a lab, citing a 2014 paper. And what is absolutely profoundly inappropriate about that paper is that they don't say, we don't know what the lab was doing. We need to know what the lab was doing. We can't make definitive statements about what the lab was doing because we're not privy to them being in March 2020 and not having access to the lab notebooks. They don't say any of that. They don't even hint at the idea that more information could be found out by understanding the experiments that were being done. They just put the curtain down and say, no, it is not from a lab. And that's the phoniness of what happened. That is a concocted narrative. That's for sure. They made it up. Now they justify it. God knows. They could even be right, by the way. But
yes.
they were not making these assertions on the basis of scientific evidence or rigorous thinking or even thinking plainly about the kind of evidence one should have to make these announcements. Now, what happened afterwards was they said this in 2020, they tamped down all of the counter arguments who were then labeled as fringe scientists, and and they thought that they would tamp this down once and for all. Then the diffuse grant was leaked, or the grant proposal was leaked. What's interesting is not one of those scientists involved in proximal origin said, "Oh, I didn't know about that. Oh, that's interesting. Well, that changes something about what we said." Not one of them. My view, they're not being honest. It's not that they're so sure, because they don't have an animal in the marketplace. They, by the way, even if there were an animal, they have no single, even remote uh, story other than hand waving about where the furin cleavage site came in. That's not a simple story. One side says, hey, we're going to put it in. That's our research program. The other side says, I don't know. I don't want to talk about it. And yet we're supposed to believe that I don't know, I don't want to talk about it as the definitive story, and just ignore what you're seeing on the other side, which says, hey, we are doing research to put that into SARS viruses.
Let me just make sure I understand. So there was already a proposal in 2017 to insert the furin cleavage site. Now, that grant was not actually funded, but no one is saying now that the technologies or the methods that they were proposing to use wouldn't work in reality. No one is saying that, are they?
No, in fact, people are telling me that the research was actually done. In fact, actually done before the research proposal went in.
Hmm.
So I've heard from one of the
Which is
reviewers.
common in NIH, which is
Yes,
common for NIH. Yes.
because I expressed to somebody, I expressed to somebody that the fact that the research proposal was turned down, to my mind, was meaningless in terms of investigation, because you constantly make a research proposal, and if it gets turned down, you continue anyway, or you. And the person said to me, Jeff, I was the reviewer. The research was done before the proposal went in. So it's even more than that we have the capability. I think I've not heard from anybody, not a single scientist, to claim that you couldn't make this thing. It's pretty straightforward, not for me, but for those who do this. And Barrick's reverse genetic system technology is the platform that makes this stuff. And so nobody's saying it can't be done. What we do know is it was the intention to do it. What we do know is that there was a massive library of materials, uh, that is genetic material, to do this. What we do know from Barrick also, very interestingly, is the motivation to do it, or at least one motivation. He explains in one interview, in a quite fascinating way. He says, look, nature makes all sorts of new viruses and so forth. We need to be ready with vaccines. And we need the most powerful possible vaccines, because we don't know what's going to come after us. So we need to test our vaccines against the most powerful pathogens. And we can't just expect that we're going to collect the most powerful pathogens. We need to make the most powerful pathogens so that we can actually test the vaccines against them. And this is stated in a 2015 interview.
I
As
just
a
want to emphasize, Jeffrey, that from the national security standpoint, that's not crazy, right? So if you think this is the way that our enemies are going to make a really dangerous weapon, well, we need to make it ourselves and test vaccines against it. So
Absolutely
it's
could
not
be.
crazy from a NatSec perspective, right? It's dangerous, but you can understand why they would act that way, operate that way.
It is true, but it is crazy to do it in a BSL-2 facility, meaning to do these experiments on dangerous pathogens in a low biosafety level
Did,
lab, which
did you
is
really mean two?
apparently
Did you really
okay.
mean two or three? I thought
I
they were both.
I meant two, because I've been told that that in Wuhan this was done in BSL-2 conditions. I don't know whether
I
that's
see. I
absolutely the
see.
fact,
It
but
should
that's what I was told.
it should definitely be three or above.
Yeah, yeah. They when they're in the spacesuits, that's four, but
Yeah.
that for show. because most of the the ironic thing, it is, as I understand it, and I may misunderstand some of these points, certainly, but as I understand it, since SARS was not so infectious, it was not classified in a pathogenic level that required a BSL-4.
Mm,
And one thought is that one of the reasons why uh, the US was partnering up with China, partly it was to get access to the vaccine, to the virus strains that were there, no doubt. Partly it may have been to observe what the Chinese were doing. And partly it may have been because they were doing it faster and quicker in a lower BSL facility. So if it had to be done in the US, there would have been a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of problems, but doing it at Wuhan wouldn't raise those problems. So I think where we are is rather straightforward, and that is the following. You have two hypotheses. They're both still viable. Could have come out of nature. It could have come out of a lab. There is not an iota of, shouldn't have put it this way. There's nothing which rules out the laboratory. And the accumulation of the evidence and the accumulation of the bad behavior, I would say, points more and more towards the lab. Because now we understand the dangerous research program, we understand the experiments, we understand the library of unreported viruses, we understand the research setting in which this was done, uh, and so on. So I think the evidence has gone more and more towards the laboratory as being the very likely explanation.
let me
The market hypothesis has many deep problems, actually, many gaps and flaws. Uh,
let me
sure.
just give the strongest defense of Barrick and Daychek and these guys. Maybe they were doing this research, and maybe they were even encouraged by national security interests of the United States to do this research. And maybe they didn't. Ultimately, maybe COVID was not a lab leak, but these guys are defending themselves because they know that they could take a lot of the heat because of their previous activities if that narrative took hold. Is that a reasonable defense of these guys, or is that too charitable?
Well, it's possible. What we know is that they're not telling us the truth about possibilities. That's for sure. We know they concocted a narrative. We don't know the full story why. There are many reasons why. One is they don't know what happened. Maybe research was being done. Maybe
Yes.
Wuhan went off on
Yes.
its own and did things, and they just don't know. That's one possibility. Second possibility is they know they were part of it and they're covering it up. Third possibility is, God, we're not sure, but we sure don't want people looking at our bio defense research because we got a lot of it. It's secret, it's classified, and we don't want people poking their noses into it. Uh, so I think the fact is we don't know, but frankly, it's not a defense. I think for scientists, the only defense is here's our lab notebooks, here's what we were doing. The chips will fall where they might, and we need to know. That's, by the way, the only justifiable position in this, which is that there is transparency. So we figure out what the heck is really going on, where this came from, what the risks are, what we need to do to stop this pandemic and move forward to stop future pandemics. There's a lot of dangerous research underway. I think this is irrefutably true, but it's unsupervised. So this is another reason to find this out because if it didn't happen this time, it's going to happen the next time. And we really need to get this under control. I personally lost confidence in NIH in this. We never got an honest view. Not only that, we got a deliberately concocted false narrative about this. And that's not satisfactory when you're dealing in high stakes risks because where could the trust possibly be? I think there are a couple of other things to add, Steve, that are important in this. It we heard, but I don't think we were hearing clearly enough what Robert Redfield, the head of the Centers for Disease Control, was saying to us. He was the head of one half of the US response to the pandemic. He believed from the start that this very likely came out of a laboratory. And Fauci shut him down. And Redfield knows a lot. So this is not some crazy outside view. This is the view of one of the most significant insiders, someone extraordinarily experienced, by the way, in the US biodefense sector, who is aware of who does what, when, and how, and who says, wait a minute, you never looked at the possibility of the laboratory. And when I raised it with Fauci, his response was to keep me out of all meetings rather than to take an honest view. So we have step by step more and more reason for thinking it's not just us looking in saying, God, this is weird. It's people that were right at the top in the midst of this being stopped from having an honest view. And what Redfield and others have also pointed out is that while we did not pick up the signals from Wuhan in the fall, because there are signals coming from everywhere in the world all the time about things, and most of them are really noise in the end. If you look back retrospectively, it's pretty clear, at least according to what I'm told, that there were some strange things happening in Wuhan already in September and October. And that fits the normal phylogenetic clock for this outbreak. Because if you look at the variants, the mutations, the strains, and you try to figure out when the original spillover occurred, the dating is October or November, not December. The market hypothesis depends on this being December. It depends on the market being the place where the spillover took place, not just a place where the virus was spread, but the genetic evidence, but also the human intelligence evidence looked at retrospectively suggests that something was happening in Wuhan, an outbreak already in September or October, and that this was potentially knowable, but in the noise of daily events, it probably wasn't really picked up until a retrospective look at the evidence. But I think that the point is we have enough to say we need an independent investigation in the United States, not waiting on China, but what NIH was doing, what major US scientific labs were doing, what they know, what the experiments were, when they were done, show us the lab books. And we have enough reason to go to that now.
Now, Jeff, you're a real world guy. You know more about how the real world operates than almost any academic. So, what are the chances? What's a scenario where we do actually get this level of transparency in the United States?
The U.S. is really good at shutting down investigations. That's been true my whole life. It took me a long time to understand they shut down any honest investigation of the Kennedy assassination, and almost anything afterwards that has been really, I won't use the term I would normally use. It's not for polite company, but any of these events, uh, the Iraq war on false pretenses and all the rest, we almost never investigate these things. And so this is pretty tough. This is calling for an investigation of ourselves. And we don't like to investigate ourselves. And our government runs on secrecy. It has really run on secrecy since the end of World War II, since the U.S. Became the world's superpower. And there's so much that goes on. I know it only, I see a lot of the shadows, the doors closing and other things, because I do see a lot, but I never see the inner sanctum. I'm not in the inner sanctum, and I don't pretend to be, and I don't want to be for that matter, because I don't like what they're doing in there. But the point is that we typically don't get honesty on core uh, issues like this one. And so I can't say that the chances are good, but I would say, practically speaking, uh, the Republican side of the House and the Senate has said something weird's going on. The Democrats have circled the wagons around Fauci, strangely, because the origin of SARS-CoV-2 is not a left-right issue, in my view. But in any event, it turned into a left-right issue like everything else in our country. And it is possible that if the Republicans win one or both houses of Congress in the November elections, that they will launch an independent investigation. I just don't know. But it's not the typical modus operandi of the US government.
I just want to share one. I wanted to give you as much time to talk as you need. I just want to share one story. So not so long before COVID began, I was in London. I had a meeting with Jeremy Farrar on a different matter, and I met his deputy, who is a former MI. I don't know if it's 5 or 6.
The
Uh,
former head of MI5, I believe.
MI5,
Yeah.
yes. So my feeling on this is that if the government is nervous because they have treaty obligations about bioweapons, but they don't want to completely give it up, it's very natural for them to funnel it through the NIH or funnel it through the Wellcome Trust, for example, which is the largest funder of medical research in the UK, I believe, or at least one of them. It's not surprising that spooky people want this program to continue for maybe legitimate national defense reasons, but they want to put it at arm's length so that they can play Fauci or NIH or Wellcome if they have to, but they want to keep some tabs on it. And it's also a good way to keep tabs on what scientists in other countries like China are doing if you're funding some of their work. If you have contacts with the leading researchers, maybe they're not doing anything related to defense. Maybe they're just trying to, understand how to build better vaccines. Nevertheless, you get a view into what is going on research wise in that country, and the former students of those people that you're monitoring, they may be working in the defense establishment in that other country. So I'm almost certain this whole network of stuff exists, and it's this kind of network that would close like this and prevent you from getting the full story of what actually happened with COVID. So, any comments on that?
Uh, One of the authors of the Proximal Origins said to me, I asked, how did you get into this? He said, well, Jeremy Farrar's spook friends called him and were very concerned about, where this virus came from. And then Jeremy called me. There was a chain of calls. But he said by himself, Jeremy's spook friends. Well, yes, what we're seeing is uh, the behavior of a highly secretive part of our government. We're not seeing much of it, but we're seeing glimpses of it. So there's no doubt that this is part of, quote, biodefense, whatever that means. And we're not supposed to see that according to strictures. But unfortunately, an epidemic broke out that has claimed 18 million lives. So people are rather interested of where this came from. And I think what you're saying is absolutely correct. This is a network, and it's a network that is the opposite of transparent. And yet, science, when it gets involved in such networks, is really unpleasant, actually. Uh, Science is our vital hold on reality. It's our vital way to address complex challenges. But of course, it's constantly suborned by the state, by power. And this was true of the nuclear age, of course. It started as a secret state project to make an atomic bomb. It meant that a lot of physics was really under the aegis of the security state. And now we see that biology is under the aegis of the security state. And a lot of high tech is under the aegis of the security state. And the security state doesn't tell us what's going on. They think for our own good. I'm not so sure. But the point is that we don't see even and one of the funny things about the security state is that even when things are in plain view, they're denied. So gaslighting, so-called, is a core part of the behavior of the security state. You see something obvious, you say it, and they say, "No, that's not there. No, that's not true. That's not true." And that's normal behavior.
I saw you on Bloomberg the other day talking about Nord Stream and who did Nord Stream, which I think most people in the world think there's at least a strong possibility the U.S. did it. And the idea that our media and government cannot even address that obvious possibility is just, it's like living in Orwell's book.
No,
Um,
Nord Stream is hilarious because, in its way, hilarious, strange word, but Biden said, "We have our ways to take this out." He said, "If Russia invades, that's the end of this pipeline." Oh, Mr. President, how could you say that? He said, "We have our ways." Then you have on uh, just an online app the ability to track planes, so we see a U.S. Poseidon flying over the site before boom. And then when boom goes off, you have the former foreign minister of Poland, Radek Sikorski, whom I know, saying "Thank you, USA," and tweeting a picture of the massive leak. And then you look at motive, which is that the U.S. has wanted to shut this down the whole time. And naturally, what do we hear in our media? I don't know. Big mystery. Then,
so
because I travel around the world, people say to me, "Jeff," one lead uh, reporter, who I'm not going to say more, just said, of course, Jeff, it's the U.S." And I said, it'd be nice if your newspaper mentioned that once in a while. But that is exactly like this. You see it straight out, and you cannot get a straight answer. You get, well, you're not welcome on this show. I was supposed to be on for a bit longer, but that was the end of that interview. So this is how this world works.
just to clarify that point, because it was the first time I had heard it from you when you were on Bloomberg, that there are publicly available radar logs of a helicopter, I think of the type the U.S. military uses, which left Gdansk, flew near the pipeline, and that was soon before the
Yeah,
explosion.
it seems that it's not a helicopter, if I understand it correctly better. It is some kind of military aircraft. And there's a Twitter account at Sander underscore 2021 on an October 1 tweet where you can look. I can't evaluate more than that, but uh, it shows a plane that is refueled in midair, then
Wow.
flies over the site, does a little curlicue, and then flies off. And this was tweeted already on October 1, and you can, it's on the website, and people can evaluate it. I can't fully, I mean, I can't even, I won't use the word fully. I can't evaluate it, but boy, I want answers. I want answers to this, just like I'd like answers to COVID, not just "we don't discuss this." I, I'll give you another one if there's, just to riff on this for one more moment. We've had this extraordinarily dangerous shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Now the Russians control the plant, and the Ukrainians are trying to take it back. And the shelling is of the plant. And our newspapers say, "Well, we don't know who's shelling it, but it's very dangerous." And I say, well, if the Russians are inside and the Ukrainians are trying to take it over, maybe it's the Ukrainians shelling it. But our media does not allow any word against Ukrainian actions, not a word. Uh, so I've asked around to very senior people. They say, "Yeah, Jeff, of course, it's Ukraine shelling the power plant." But you can't find that in the public discourse because we are told stories, and we're told them whether they make any sense, even when they're absolutely captured on film. Doesn't matter. We're told stories. And that's how the US government operates.
I think it's especially infuriating to scientists and academics who are used to carefully reading the evidence and demand some level of honesty and integrity and self consistency in the kinds of things that they read. And the current era is just it's driving us nuts, I think.
Yeah, and also, our lives are you go into a seminar and your colleagues attack you to like nothing if you make one slip, because you're supposed to be on your toes with the evidence and being able to make your case, and that's a healthy process. That's the really healthy process. So we're confronting a sociology of knowledge in this case that's completely different. Uh, the government's not interested in the truth. The government's interested in the message. The government's interested in the power. The government's interested in the outcome. The government may say very well, hey, we're protecting you, you idiot, whatever it is. But it's not interested in, well, who took out the pipeline or who created or where did the virus come from or who's shelling the power plant. Not interested in those questions, really.
Well, Jeff, I want to say I really admire your courage. And I imagine the last year of your life has been maybe qualitatively different from all the previous ones because you come out against the narrative on some key topics. Do you want to say anything about that? Has there been a personal cost for you?
Well, look, I think we're in a dangerous situation worldwide. So I think we need some truth. That's the basic point.
Great.